All right, hello everyone. Welcome to today's discussion. We're looking at the question of worship in an era of COVID-19. And with me today are our Director of Law and Public Policy, Andre Schutten, and ARPA's Legal Counsel, John Sikkema. And we're going to answer and look at a couple of questions that are related to this question of worship. So a couple things have changed in the past week. Do you guys want to talk about that?
I think it's been really good news coming out of Ontario and also Alberta. Actually, pretty surprising news. First of all, Ontario on Monday announced that there's going to be quite a big step forward for corporate worship services, 30% of building capacity for churches across the province. It wasn't super clear during the press conference on Monday whether it was going to be a regional approach or not, but we're quite certain it's not a regional approach. It's across the province. All church buildings will be allowed to have up to 30% capacity in Ontario. We're unsure. Hey, John, you and I were talking about this, about whether or not this also applies to outdoor services. We want to see what the actual regulation says. So until we see the text of that, which might not be published until Friday, so we'll have to wait and see. But this actually might mean that we can proceed with outdoor services at full size. We'll have to wait and see. And then Alberta as well just announced this week on Tuesday, I think, Tuesday or Wednesday, that there's no limit on corporate worship services. It can be full capacity if they choose. But maybe, John, you want to comment on that, but that doesn't mean necessarily that Alberta churches should, jump right away to full services this coming Sunday.
Right. My understanding is the government is still, it's not clear to me yet whether it's legally required or if it's a guideline, but it seems to me that it's on the side of the guideline, that they're saying we're trusting church leaders to make sure that there's hygiene measures in place, that at least family units give there's some space between them. So obviously we would encourage people to adopt best practices, even if it's not legally required, if it's just guidelines, just to be good neighbors and to eliminate any concern going forward that reimposing regulations on churches would be considered necessary. But we're grateful for that approach of the Alberta government to basically say, hey, you know what the guidelines are, or at least we'll give you some guidelines, but we're not going to have a legal cap on it. So kind of back over to you, take care of your own congregation and community, and that's good to see from the Alberta government.
We need to take responsibility. Churches need to take responsibility. So just because the civil government for the past 3 months has basically been dictating, okay, this is what's safe and this is what's not, and we've been just following the civil government's lead. Now that the civil government, particularly in Alberta, has backed off and said, okay, we're now trusting you as churches to make wise decisions, don't take that to mean that they're necessarily saying, oh, go ahead, it's completely safe, no problems, no issues at all, pack your church to 100% capacity. No. There's a very specific tone shift, I think, in Alberta from the government, where they're saying, we're going to trust you. We're entrusting you. It's almost like a teenager being given keys to the car. It doesn't mean go drive wild as you like, but here's the keys. Do your job. And I think I'm very confident that the vast majority of churches in Alberta will be careful. They'll be cautious. So maybe they'll do 50%, maybe they'll do 75%. That's for that local church government to determine.
All right, so we were talking over the last couple of weeks that Ontario seemed to be kind of behind the game when it came to reopening. And now they, in some ways, have led the charge. What implications do you think that has for the rest of the country?
Yeah, so we just checked into the regulations in British Columbia and Manitoba, just as two other examples. We've got lots of supporters in those provinces, and British Columbia still has a 50-person cap for corporate worship, and that's not related to the size of the church building. So theoretically you could have a 2,000-person building and still only have 50 people there. BC has been, and we've always been applauding it actually over the last 3 months, that British Columbia has actually had the most has allowed the largest number of people to worship throughout this entire pandemic, and there hasn't been outbreaks in British Columbia quite like we've seen in Ontario and Quebec, for example. And so we've always found British Columbia to be quite reasonable through the last 3 months, but now they're actually lagging behind Alberta, Alberta and Ontario, and maybe even Quebec is toying with some changes as well. In Manitoba, the cap is still at 25 for indoor and 50 for outdoor, 50 people and 25 people. There too, I think what this means for those provinces is that, first of all, for Christians, they can be encouraged that in other provinces, big steps are being made to accommodate religious worship. There's recognition by the civil government in both of those provinces to say, we not only trust those religious communities, but we also recognize the importance of corporate worship. That's not just something we do because we're interested in it, sort of like some people are really into yoga or something like that. It's not like that. This goes to the core of who we are, but from the Christian perspective, it's also how God would have us worship Him. He invites us to worship Him corporately Sunday by Sunday, and that's huge. It's really, really important to us.
Throughout this time, over the last couple of weeks, ARPA's been focusing more on this interaction of church and state and the authority that each would have and what their sort of sphere of influence is. What do you think maybe just talk about that and what the implications of that have been over the last couple of months?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the whole question of sphere sovereignty, coming through Reformed thought over the last couple of centuries, that God in His Word has instituted various spheres that have their own responsibility. The church, the family, the state, other spheres have been developed in Reformed thought over the last number of decades and centuries. And they each have their own responsibility. The church has responsibility for corporate worship, for sacraments, for proclaiming the gospel, preaching the gospel, for ministry of mercy in many respects, for church discipline and so on. But that's the core of what the church is responsible for. And then the state is responsible for a few other things as well. Punishing the wicked, protecting the good. So public health would probably be in that, protecting the good, advancing the good. And sometimes those kind of they interact or overlap or bump into each other, and certainly we're experiencing that in a big way through this COVID era, in a way that I don't think we've had to wrestle with this question quite like we have in the last 3 months, at least since I would say back to World War II, really. So probably in living memory for the vast majority of us in the Reformed community, this question has not been put to us in a hard way. We dealt with it a little bit in the whole Wall case at the Supreme Court of Canada, but not quite to this extent. Anyway, that said, I would say there's a couple of lessons we can actually learn from the legal world. So in the legal world, in constitutional law in Canada, there's a number of different principles or concepts that are talked about the relationship between Parliament and the Supreme Court, for example. And one of those is called dialogue. They talk about the dialogue between those two institutions. So if a law is passed by Parliament and it gets challenged in court as being unconstitutional, then the Supreme Court can rule on it. If they strike down the law, they'll give reasons why, then Parliament responds and they pass a new law that's slightly tweaked, and that might also get challenged. It goes back to Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can strike it down again or uphold it. And one constitutional scholar in particular has described that as a dialogue between those institutions, where they have a mutual respect for each other, but they're dialoguing in a way back and forth to craft good law, good public policy. And I think there's a lesson there for us as church and state in Canada as well, that we don't just say, oh, it's a global pandemic, the state takes over and it's going to dictate to everyone, including the church, what needs to happen. Instead, let's see dialogue where the state says, look, global pandemic, we should be concerned, public health risk, we got to protect senior citizens in particular. So these are the measures we're rolling out, and then they dialogue with the church and say, look, church, we've got to take action. What are you doing to respond to this? And actually, so some people feel like, well, if they didn't order the churches to lock down, then they wouldn't have. But that's not true, actually. For those who remember early March, most churches, I didn't know of a single church that wasn't already putting in major safeguards before provincial governments locked down churches. Certainly in Ontario, I know my own church, your church as well, Colin. So all of these churches were putting in major restrictions on their own corporate worship for safekeeping. So I think that dialogue is a healthy model to have in mind between church and state. I think that's a better way forward. There's more though I think we can learn about from the legal world.
Yeah, I think just starting on that, if you take the the metaphor of the wall of separation between church and state, that we I think rightly take that as respecting the basic calling and basic jurisdiction of each institution.
Right.
One institution doesn't control the other, but certainly that the metaphor of the wall might imply that there's no back and forth, there's no influence, there's no communication. I think that would be wrong. For the church to say we'd like to coordinate with the government, cooperate with the government on its public health goals, and also for the government to say, communicate with the church, say how can we allow you to keep doing your mission and your calling in a way that is right. So there's that important communication there that can happen while still respecting each other's jurisdictions. And I think too that as we've wrestled with this and looked at questions of can the government tell the church what to do in the church's own building or how many congregants to meet with and so on, does that raise the issue of sphere sovereignty? It doesn't raise the issue of the government going outside of its own sphere and so on. And I think that one thing that I think we can largely agree on is, again, the attitude of submission. Obviously, submission to government is framed in submission to God. Render to Caesar is framed in render to God the things that are God's.
Right.
It's always framed that ultimate obedience to God and to your duty to God as the institutional church. And I think that within the church building, there is overlapping jurisdiction. We use the example of, when you're driving your car down the road, there's the federal government has jurisdiction to say, prohibit you from transporting illegal drugs in your car, while the provincial government has jurisdiction to tell you, how to operate that car on the road.
Right.
And they both have to respect each other's lawmaking jurisdiction, but they're both applying to your car.
Right.
The same thing kind of with the church building that, and the congregation and the pastors and office bearers, that they are under two different spheres of authority. They both can affect even what they do as church, but again, it should be in different aspects, right? So you've got fire safety, public health safety in the church building and so on.
Right.
We've even used the example of, when you drive to church, the elders may be calling you to the worship service, but you still got to obey the laws of the road.
Right.
I think that applies here too. And the question of at what point is it required to disobey the government? I think that's for office bearers specifically to work out. But I think that we shouldn't say, well, the government says 30%, we think 50% would be appropriate. If we were in charge, we'd make it 50%, we're going to make it 50%. That's just maybe to disrespect the office of the magistrate in their public health rulemaking. But if the government says our rules are so strict that you as church believe you cannot even fulfill the basic tasks that God requires of you, say preaching the gospel, administering the sacraments, baptizing new members, basic evangelism or visiting people and so on. The basic, I think you as office bearer or as even as church members to say, this goes so far that it prevents us from doing what we have a duty to do. Right. It would essentially require disobedience by omission or negligence. Right. That may be where disobedience is required. But where you can submit, even with some burden, like let's say you have to host multiple church services to kind of get everyone in the door and have the sacraments, that maybe that's something that you can do. So it's a burden, but you can obey your duty to God as the institutional church while also submitting to the government where it's enacting laws that have legitimate purposes like protecting public health.
Yeah, and I think that it becomes a bit clearer, like with Ontario in particular. So where Ontario was for the last 3 months, I think, for most of March and April, most churches and church leadership were saying, look, this total ban on corporate worship, and by corporate worship I mean the ability to come together physically to be with each other to worship. So the number doesn't really matter, but the limit was 5 or less, and that, if you're in a congregation of 500 people, 5 or less, corporately worshiping together,
doesn't work.
No, it doesn't work, and certainly doesn't work where you celebrate the sacrament of Lord's Supper, which has to be done in communion. It has to be done together as one body, physically present. That matters. That's an important part of it. So for March and April, I think that most church leadership were saying, look, we see the same thing. We're submitting to civil government, and we would have made similar calls anyway. Maybe we would have allowed smaller groups in 25 people or 50 people or something like that. But we see the urgency here. But as we crawled into May, I think a lot of church leadership was saying, look, we can't keep doing this. We have to be able to, in particular, celebrate the sacrament together. 3 months without the sacrament of Lord's Supper is a very long time, and we all confess that the sacrament there is a means of grace by which we strengthen the faith of the people in the congregation. It's a blessing that we need. We can't live spiritually for long without it. Like, we need it. So I think then we start asking that question. Like, so we've gone back and forth with certain pastors who said, look, we've never been prohibited from preaching the gospel. And I agree, because we've been able to preach the gospel through virtual means. So it's not the question of whether or not we've been able to preach the gospel. That hasn't been curtailed, really. It's the question of corporate worship, so the encouragement and the experience of being side by side with brothers and sisters, singing praise to God. Like, when I sing in church, I'm not singing for myself and for God. When I sing in church, I'm also, through that, encouraging the brother or sister sitting beside me. When we pray corporately as a body in one place, there is something happening there that is different than if we're all scattered in our own homes doing our own thing. But it becomes clear. I think we get a clearer picture when you bring in the sacrament of Lord's Supper. And I don't think anyone could say, certainly not in the Reformed tradition, there's anyone that could say that has not been impeded or that has not been hindered. It has been. And it's for the pastors and the elders of the congregation to be the advocate on that question, to advocate for the right to celebrate that sacrament together. So I think that's where you get into that nuance about, okay, is it merely a burden that's been imposed on us, but we can still do it, but it's a burden, in which case submit to the civil government's burden that they've imposed on you, versus have they prohibited something outright that you really feel you called by God that you ought to do, in which case you might have to consider whether or not you can submit. And that's a question that ARPA can't answer. That's a question that elders have to answer.
Finally, there's rumors circulating about the possibility of another lockdown coming later in this year, possible resurgence of the virus. What implications do you think that has for this discussion?
Yeah, I think the discussion's not over. In fact, I think now we have opportunity over the next month, 2 months, 3 months, to reflect on the last 3 months and to think more deeply about, what is the role of the church? What is the role of the state? What does, being a pastor and elder as a shepherd of a flock, what does that look like to be the advocate for, the defender of, the nourisher of your flock? What does it mean to bring them to pasture and ensure that they're safe and protected and fed, also in a time of crisis? And I think that the threat, whether or not it happens, we'll have to wait and see. But certainly there's been a lot of talk about it. If in fact there's going to be a second spike or a second wave in the fall or in the winter, I hope that we as churches will be better equipped and more ready to know in our own minds, okay, where's the line? And I think coming into this whole crisis, we didn't know where the line was. I'll speak only for myself. I think I've shifted quite a bit over the last 3 months in understanding, just because I didn't, the idea of separation of church and state or of the distinct spheres of society, that worked well in theory in my mind. Like, oh yeah, it's pretty straightforward, church is responsible for these things, state is responsible for these things, whatever. But then when the rubber hits the road and you get a pandemic like this, then suddenly it's like, you got to think about it and tease it out a whole lot more. So in that sense, it's been good that God is through this also testing us to see, okay, what do you understand and know about how I would have you live, also in the face of a global pandemic. That's been good and healthy, but that's not drop the ball now. We've got breathing room now for the next 3-4 months. Let's think about this. Take the time to pray about it and read scripture and see what we can glean from that, and look at what other Reformed and Christian thinkers have been writing about this for hundreds of years, and see what we can learn about that, so that when the next lockdown comes down, we can engage it properly.
I was curious if you want to say more about I'm becoming the host, but you're talking about churches, just speaking practically in terms of responding to the virus itself. that if there is to be a resurgence of cases or a slight uptick in new cases discovered, and maybe there's concerns for new regulations or rules on churches, that maybe churches simply by monitoring their own congregations and inviting members of the congregation to report their own illnesses, if anyone in the congregation gets it, to let the elders know. So not that the elders can play doctors, that they can let the community know, and also be able to report to local officials and provincial officials that here's what's been going on in our community and how we've dealt with that in terms of effective contact tracing. And actually the local church, if it's allowed to and if it takes responsibility, can be actually quite an effective tool for keeping people safe and monitoring who has it and who they're socially connected to.
Yeah, I think that again, I have a lot of respect for local churches and local governments, and I think that they'll be very responsible. And so I think that the idea of us demonstrating to the civil government, not just with words but with actions, how we're being careful and cautious, and not living in fear, but living carefully and cautiously, out of a spirit of love and concern for our neighbors, first in our congregation and then in the broader community. So things like our effective contact tracing is an excellent example. That there's a bit of an irony, I think, in that because churches are so good at contact tracing, they're easy to identify as being a hotspot, right? So if a church has a meeting and one person gets sick and then a few other people around them get sick, well, that's the reason we can trace that is because we know each other in a congregation. We know, Brother John Smith just reported sick, and oh yeah, we were in church with him on Sunday and we sat nearby, and now so and so was also sick. Well, that's an easy contact trace to make, but that also makes that church an easy target to say, oh, churches are horrible. We've got to shut down churches because look at that outbreak happened there. Yeah, but just because it's easy to trace doesn't mean that they're at a higher risk than other gatherings. I mean, take the protests, for example, that we've seen in downtown Toronto and downtown Ottawa. You have 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 people milling about, moving in and out. People are covered up with masks. You can't identify. You don't know anybody's name.
Or in your local busy Walmart,
Yeah.
What did you touch on the shelf that someone else touched?
Yeah, exactly.
You don't know.
So those kinds of like you'll never be able to identify those as hotspots. I mean, if the person at the Tim Hortons drive-through, is sick or was sick, how many people will go through that drive-through and be potentially exposed? And would you be able to trace it back to that person, or it'd be nearly impossible. So yeah, I think we can actually see the church's ability to do really effective contact tracing as being a strength, and we shouldn't shy away from that. And we should demonstrate to the civil government and say, look how effective we are. We found out that when this happened, we were able to right away inform the entire congregation. The people that were sitting close were able to monitor their own health and their own symptoms, and 3 other people also had symptoms, so they right away isolated. We did 14 days, etc., and it shows that we're intelligent and we're responsive and we're compassionate and we act, and that's a good thing. And yeah, I think civil government should grow in their respect for us in that sense.
All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Andre and John, for this discussion. Thanks to you for watching. If you have any questions or comments, we'd welcome them in the comment section below, or send your emails to info@arpacanada.ca. Thanks very much.